The air in Committee Room 2154 of the Rayburn House Office Building usually hummed with a predictable, almost soporific drone. It was the sound of bureaucracy in motion, measured tones, carefully phrased questions, the rustle of papers, and the occasional pre-orchestrated burst of partisan grandstanding. But on this particular Tuesday morning, the hum had died. It hadn't faded. It had been abruptly extinguished, replaced by a dead silence so profound it seemed to absorb all light and sound. This wasn't the polite hush that falls when a presiding officer calls for order, or the respectful quiet that precedes a moment of solemnity. This was the kind of breathless, charged quiet that precedes an explosion, the unmistakable calm before an unexpected storm, a silence so dense it pressed against the eardrums, a palpable tension that foretold a reckoning. Committee Room 2154, with its imposing mahogany table, rows of high-backed leather chairs, and the stern, unblinking portraits of former congressional figures gazing down from the paneled walls, had been the stage for countless heated debates. Legislation had been born and buried within its confines. Careers had been forged and fractured. Ideologies had clashed, and compromises had been painstakingly brokered. But even in its long and storied history, spanning decades of legislative battles, it had never quite witnessed anything like what was about to unfold between two of the most sharp-tongued Democrats in Congress, Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas and Representative Ted Lieu of California. Representative Jasmine Crockett, a formidable figure even when seated, occupied her usual spot at the far end of the committee table. Her posture was erect, almost regal, a testament to years of disciplined advocacy. Her papers were meticulously arranged before her, each document precisely aligned, a testament to her methodical preparation and her deep respect for the issues at hand. Her expression was calm, almost serene, yet underscored by an undeniable focus, a quiet intensity that hinted at vast, untapped reserves of strength and a will of iron. Across from her, Representative Ted Lieu, ever the picture of congressional propriety, seemingly oblivious to the subtle seismic shift in the room's atmosphere, adjusted the knot of his impeccably tied tie, a nervous habit that betrayed a flicker of his underlying tension. He cleared his throat, a small, almost imperceptible sound in the suffocating silence. He was, in that moment, completely unaware that he was about to walk into what would become the most talked-about political moment of the week, a legislative skirmish that would transcend procedural minutiae and erupt into a profoundly personal and public reckoning. If anyone in that room harbored the illusion that they understood the predictable rhythm of congressional debates, they were about to have their expectations shattered beyond repair. What transpired next wasn't the typical choreographed partisan back and forth that dominated cable news cycles. This was something entirely different. These were two allies, members of the same political party, often seen collaborating on other issues, now about to clash not over trivial procedural matters or superficial political points, but over the very foundations of justice, accountability, and the sacred meaning of representing the people. It was a confrontation born of differing philosophies, shaped by divergent life experiences, and fueled by an unwavering commitment, albeit from fundamentally different angles, to what each believed was the truest path to justice. It was an ideological schism laid bare, a collision of pragmatism and idealism, all unfolding in the unforgiving glare of public scrutiny. Before delving deeper into this incredible, tension-fraught story, a brief but essential interlude. If you find yourself captivated by moments of raw, unscripted political drama, the kind that rips through the veneer of decorum and exposes the beating heart of democracy, then ensure you hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell. Trust me, you absolutely do not want to miss these pivotal moments, where history is made not by grand speeches, but by uncomfortable truths spoken aloud. We've got plenty more like them awaiting their turn in the spotlight. The hearing itself was, ostensibly, routine. The House Judiciary Committee, a body often at the epicenter of contentious legal and constitutional debates, was convened to review proposed changes to federal sentencing guidelines. On paper, the agenda sounded about as thrilling as watching paint dry, a dry procedural matter, buried deep within the arcane machinery of the legislative process. Yet, it is often in these seemingly mundane settings when expectations are at their lowest, that the most explosive moments happen, catching everyone off guard and redefining the political landscape. To truly grasp the magnitude of what unfolded in Committee Room 2154, one needed to understand the two individuals at its heart, Jasmine Crockett and Ted Lieu. Their impending clash between two figures who, on the surface, should have been aligned, made it all the more shocking to every single person who bore witness, transforming a bureaucratic meeting into a public crucible. Representative Jasmine Crockett from Texas is anything but your typical politician. Before her ascent to Capitol Hill, a journey she had undertaken with a clear sense of purpose, she dedicated years of her life as a public defender. Her battlegrounds were not the polished halls of Congress, but the often gritty, emotionally charged courtrooms of the American legal system. There, amidst the stale air and flickering fluorescent lights, she tirelessly fought for those who couldn't afford the luxury of expensive lawyers, the marginalized, the forgotten, the vulnerable, the voiceless. Her career forged a unique and unyielding lens through which she viewed justice, a lens unclouded by abstract legal theories, but sharpened by the raw, often heartbreaking realities of human lives caught in the inexorable gears of the justice system. She possesses a rare gift for articulation, a way of speaking that cuts through political nonsense like a knife through butter. Her delivery is sharp, her message direct, and she is absolutely fearless when it comes to calling out what she perceives as injustice, no matter the political cost or the formidable stature of her opponent. Her passion isn't performative. It's deeply ingrained, born of countless hours spent in sterile interview rooms, comforting distraught families, and advocating for individuals whose fates hung precariously in the balance of a system that often seemed rigged against them. She carried the weight of those experiences with her, an invisible but potent armor. On the opposing side of this burgeoning divide sat Representative Ted Lieu from California. Lieu's background is equally formidable, though markedly different, shaping a distinct worldview. He is a former prosecutor, a legal mind honed by the pursuit of justice from the state's perspective, trained to seek convictions and uphold the letter of the law. Beyond his distinguished legal career, he is a decorated veteran of the United States Air Force, a background that instilled a disciplined, methodical, and strategically analytical approach to problem solving. Lieu has meticulously built his reputation on being methodical, logical, and incredibly skilled at dismantling arguments with precision and intellectual rigor. He is well known for his prolific and often witty Twitter presence, where he frequently engages in sharp, concise legal and political commentary, earning him a reputation as a shrewd and intelligent communicator. His strength lies in his ability to translate complex legal points into simple, understandable language, making intricate issues accessible to a broader audience. He champions reason and evidence, often viewing emotional appeals with a degree of skepticism, preferring instead the unassailable fortress of irrefutable facts and airtight logic. His approach was one of careful calculation, of understanding the mechanisms of power and wielding them with surgical precision. These two, Crockett and Lieu, should have been natural allies. Both were accomplished lawyers, steeped in the intricacies of the law. Both were devout Democrats, committed to advancing progressive policies that aimed to improve society. And crucially, both were passionately committed to justice reform. They shared the fundamental belief that the American justice system, for all its ideals and stated purposes, was flawed and in dire need of significant overhaul. Yet, as anyone who has navigated the labyrinthine corridors of politics understands, sometimes the biggest and most ferocious fights erupt not between opposing parties, but within one's own. Ideological nuances, personal experiences, and differing strategic approaches, the pragmatic versus the transformative, can create chasms even among those who share the same foundational goals, turning allies into antagonists in the pursuit of a shared ideal. The specific focus of the committee meeting that day was the Federal Sentencing Reform Act, a piece of proposed legislation that aimed to significantly alter how judges impose sentences for certain nonviolent crimes. To the average citizen, the title alone might induce yawns. It sounds boring, an arcane legal matter relegated to the back pages of congressional reports, devoid of human drama. But for the millions of Americans languishing in prison cells, for their families scarred by separation and the crushing weight of a broken system, and for the communities grappling with the societal consequences of mass incarceration, this act was anything but boring. This legislation held the keys to their futures, their hopes for reunification, and the desperate yearning for a justice system that would, at long last, begin treating people with genuine fairness and equity. For many, it represented the flickering flame of hope in a dark, unforgiving landscape. Crockett had been a relentless advocate for stronger, more immediate reforms. Her proposals were bold, even radical to some in the more conservative corners of her party. She championed the complete elimination of mandatory minimums for drug offenses, arguing with fervent conviction that they stripped judges of their critical discretion and led to disproportionately harsh sentences, particularly for people of color caught in the crosshairs of a racially biased system. She vehemently argued for more discretion for judges, believing that nuance and individual circumstances should always outweigh rigid, one-size-fits-all penalties that failed to account for human complexity. Above all, she wanted the system to fundamentally shift its focus from punishment to rehabilitation, to recognize the inherent worth of every individual and offer pathways to redemption. Her years as a public defender had provided her with a visceral, first-hand understanding of how the current system destroyed lives, shattered families, and perpetuated intergenerational cycles of poverty and incarceration, especially within communities of color. She had witnessed the futility of incarceration without genuine efforts at reintegration, the crushing weight of a system designed more for retribution than redemption, and it fueled her every utterance. Lieu, while undeniably supportive of reform, approached the issue with a more cautious, measured hand. His experience as a former prosecutor deeply informed his perspective. He understood, perhaps more acutely than Crockett, the concerns of law enforcement and the complexities of ensuring public safety. He worried about the potential for going too far too fast, of unintended consequences that might erode public trust or lead to an increase in crime. His philosophy leaned towards incremental change, a belief in building broad consensus and meticulously ensuring that any reforms implemented would not only be effective, but also sustainable over the long term. He was a pragmatist, seeking the achievable good over the elusive perfect, convinced that enduring progress required careful steps, not revolutionary leaps. He believed in the power of slow, deliberate progress, meticulously crafted and widely supported, to prevent backlash and ensure longevity. The tension between the two had been building for weeks, a subtle but unmistakable undercurrent in previous committee meetings, almost a silent war of attrition. It manifested not in overt hostility, but in the nuanced differences in their body language, the slight inflections in their voices, the way their eyes would occasionally meet across the table, holding a silent, unspoken debate. Crockett would deliver a passionate, emotionally resonant argument for sweeping, transformative changes, her voice imbued with the urgency of lived experience, her hands occasionally gesturing with emphasis. Lieu would respond with measured concerns about implementation, about the practicalities of scaling reforms, about the need for empirical data and careful pilot programs, his demeanor calm, almost academic. Neither was inherently wrong. Their positions were simply born of completely different professional and personal journeys. Crockett spoke from the heart of the incarcerated. Lieu spoke from the mind of the legal architect. Their differences were not of malice, but of methodology, of how best to mend a broken system. On the morning of the hearing, the buzz among staffers was palpable. Whispers of potential fireworks circulated through the congressional offices, a low hum of anticipation. Both representatives had made specific requests for additional time to speak, a departure from the usual time allotments for a hearing of this nature. Both had painstakingly prepared extensive remarks, polishing their arguments, anticipating counterpoints, and honing their rhetoric. And both, according to sources close to the committee, were determined to make their case once and for all, to lay out their full vision for the future of federal sentencing with unwavering conviction. What nobody, absolutely nobody, expected was just how personal it would get. The carefully constructed lines between policy and deeply held conviction were about to blur then shatter under the immense pressure of their conflicting visions. The hearing room was more crowded than usual. Word had clearly leaked that something out of the ordinary might transpire. Reporters, who typically bypassed these seemingly dry committee meetings in favor of more dramatic legislative battles on the House floor, were suddenly very interested, their cameras set up on tripods, notebooks at the ready, poised to capture any deviation from the norm. Criminal justice advocates filled the gallery, a sea of anxious, hopeful faces. Some were there to lend silent, fervent support to Crockett's more aggressive, immediate approach to reform, their hopes pinned on a transformative shift. Others, more cautious, aligned themselves with Lieu's measured, incremental strategy, believing it offered a more realistic path to lasting change, a surer footing. The air was thick with anticipation, a collective holding of breath, a sense of an impending storm. Committee Chairman Jerry Nadler, a seasoned veteran of congressional skirmishes, his face etched with years of legislative battles, called the session to order at 10:15 a.m. His voice, usually a booming resonance that filled the chamber, was slightly subdued, as if he too sensed the unusual gravity of the moment, a disturbance in the usual rhythm of congressional life. The first hour proceeded with textbook normalcy. Expert witnesses, professors of criminology, former wardens, statisticians, and economists testified about recidivism rates, the effectiveness of drug courts, and the staggering economic impact of mass incarceration on state and federal budgets. It was standard stuff, data points and projections presented with the dry detachment of academic discourse, the kind of information that typically drew blank stares and idle fidgeting. The audience shuffled, some doodled, some checked their phones, waiting for the tedious prologue to end, unaware of the explosive drama that was about to unfold. And then came the moment that changed everything. Chairman Nadler, scanning the room with a practiced eye, recognized Representative Lieu for 5 minutes of questioning. Lieu, composed and articulate as always, his voice even and unhurried, thanked the chairman and began what seemed like a routine inquiry, focusing on the practicalities of implementation timelines for the proposed sentencing changes. He spoke of logistics, resource allocation, bureaucratic hurdles inherent in such sweeping reforms, all delivered with his characteristic precision. It was all very reasonable, very much in line with his methodical reputation, building a case for caution and careful planning. But then he pivoted. His voice, usually precise, took on a carefully measured, almost pedagogical tone as he delivered a statement that would light the fuse. While I appreciate the passion of some of my colleagues, Lieu began, his gaze sweeping generally across the committee, studiously avoiding direct eye contact with Crockett, we need to be realistic about what's actually possible. We can't let perfect be the enemy of good. Sometimes the most responsible thing we can do is move forward with reforms that can actually pass, rather than holding out for idealistic changes that will never see the light of day. The phrase, idealistic changes, hung in the air, a barbed challenge, a subtle but undeniably pointed jab. It wasn't an accusation leveled directly at Crockett, but everyone in the room, from the most junior staffer to the most seasoned committee member, knew exactly who he was talking about. It was a subtle, yet undeniably pointed jab at Crockett's unwavering pursuit of sweeping, transformative reform. It was the pragmatist chiding the idealist, the realist cautioning the visionary, a direct philosophical broadside cloaked in measured language. Crockett's expression remained outwardly impassive, a mask of calm composure. Yet, for those who knew her, those who had seen her navigate countless high-stakes courtrooms and political battles, the shift was perceptible. Her shoulders straightened just a fraction of an inch, a subtle tensing of muscles. Her pen, which had been idly tracing patterns on her notepad, stilled, its tip hovering motionless above the paper. The subtle rigidity of her posture, the quiet stillness of her hand, signaled a deep internal shift. She was no longer merely listening, absorbing the words. She was preparing for battle, gathering her internal forces, readying herself for the inevitable counterattack. The calm exterior belied a gathering storm within. Lieu, perhaps emboldened by the lack of an immediate, overt reaction, and apparently oblivious to the subtle seismic tremors he had just unleashed, continued, pressing his point with the unshakable conviction of a prosecutor laying out his most critical case. I've prosecuted cases, he stated, his voice now imbued with the authority of personal first-hand experience, where repeat offenders committed serious crimes after being released early due to what were, at the time, well-intentioned reforms. I've seen the devastation that can cause to families and communities. Any reform we pass needs to account for public safety concerns, not just rehabilitation ideals. That word again, ideals. This time it wasn't just a challenge. It was a match that lit the powder keg. It wasn't just a policy disagreement. It felt like a profound dismissal of her entire life's work, her deeply held convictions, her very purpose. For Crockett, ideals wasn't a flaw, but a guiding star, and to dismiss them was to dismiss the humanity she fought for. When Lieu finished his questioning, a silent, heavy vacuum of tension filled the room. Chairman Nodler, perhaps sensing the delicate, volatile nature of the atmosphere, moved to recognize the next member, attempting to guide the hearing back to its preordained trajectory to restore order to the proceedings. But before he could even fully articulate the words, Crockett's voice, clear and cutting, sliced through the quiet. "Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice steady but firm, an undeniable force that commanded attention. "I'd like to respond to the gentleman's comments." Nodler paused, his hand hovering over his list of speakers, a flicker of exasperation, then resignation crossing his face. This was highly unorthodox. Congressional hearings operated on strict protocols. Members directed their questions to expert witnesses, not to each other in direct, unprompted rebuttals. But the tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to be cut with a knife. Nodler, with decades of experience navigating the unpredictable currents of congressional dynamics, could feel the charge in the air, the collective anticipation of something extraordinary. He knew, instinctively, that attempting to shut this down, to rigidly enforce the usual rules, would only intensify the pressure, perhaps even make the situation explode more dramatically. The contained energy needed an outlet, and he recognized he had little choice but to provide it. "The gentlewoman from Texas is recognized for 5 minutes, he conceded, his tone suggesting a resigned sigh, a faint regret already settling in. He knew this wasn't going to be a polite exchange. It was going to be a battle. Crockett stood up slowly, deliberately. She didn't need to raise her voice or pound the table to command attention. Every single eye in the room, from the bored reporter to the earnest law student, was already riveted on her, drawn in by the sheer force of her presence. The camera lights seemed to intensify, sensing the moment, zooming in on her, capturing every nuance. "Thank you, Mr. Chairman," she began, her voice a deceptively calm prelude to the storm she was about to unleash. "I find it interesting that my distinguished colleague from California thinks fighting for real justice is idealistic." The word idealistic dripped with a carefully controlled sarcasm, turning Lieu's dismissive term back on him with surgical precision. The air crackled with unspoken challenge. She paused, letting the statement hang in the profound silence, allowing its full weight to settle. Then, her voice dropped slightly, taking on a more personal, almost intimate tone, yet it resonated with a raw power that filled every corner of the room, piercing through the professional veneer. "I wonder," she continued, her gaze now fixed directly on Lieu, unwavering, unblinking, "if he thought it was idealistic when I was sitting in jail cells at 2 a.m., trying to convince 19-year-old kids that the system might actually work for them someday." The room went completely silent. Not a single rustle of paper, not a cough, not a whisper. This wasn't the staged theatrical debate that typically played out in these chambers, designed for sound bites and political points. This was about to get raw, real, profoundly personal. It was a direct emotional blow, a stark reminder that behind the policy debates lay human lives and undeniable suffering. What happened next wasn't merely a debate, a polite exchange of differing viewpoints, or even a heated discussion. It was a masterclass in political confrontation, delivered not with bombast or bluster, but with surgical precision and devastating effectiveness, cutting to the very core of their divergent philosophies. Crockett didn't sit back down. She remained standing behind her chair, her hands resting lightly on the polished wood of the backrest, her posture radiating quiet strength, a warrior prepared for battle. Her eyes, unwavering, were locked onto Lieu, a direct, challenging gaze that demanded his full attention and offered no quarter. When she spoke again, her voice remained remarkably calm, a stark contrast to the emotional weight of her words. It carried the undeniable gravity of someone who had witnessed too much injustice to ever stay quiet, someone whose convictions were forged in the crucible of harsh reality. This was not merely an intellectual exercise for her. It was a testament to the lives she had seen shattered, the families she had seen torn apart, the dreams she had seen extinguished by a system that often prioritized punishment over people, and it resonated with a chilling authenticity. But before she launched into the full breadth of her response, something remarkable happened, something almost imperceptible yet profoundly significant. The room itself seemed to shift. Committee hearings typically possess a formal, almost sterile atmosphere, a rigid adherence to protocol where everyone speaks in careful, measured tones, meticulously chosen not to offend, not to deviate from the established script, a carefully constructed illusion of civility. Suddenly, that carefully constructed atmosphere evaporated. It was replaced by something electric, something real, something visceral. The air thrummed with an unscripted energy, an acknowledgement that the veil of polite pretense had been ripped away, revealing the raw, beating heart of genuine disagreement, of deeply held beliefs clashing without filters. You could see it in the other committee members. Their side conversations, their idle shuffling of papers, their distracted glances at their phones, all ceased abruptly. They sat up straighter, their faces turning towards Crockett, their expressions shifting from passive attendance to active, almost mesmerized engagement. They weren't just listening, they were actually paying attention, sensing a rare, authentic moment unfolding before their eyes, a deviation from the predictable rhythm of legislative life. You could see it in the court reporter, whose fingers had been rhythmically dancing across her machine, capturing every word. She paused, then sat up straighter, her posture rigid, her eyes wide, realizing she was about to transcribe something that might very well make history. A moment that transcended the mundane flow of legislative record-keeping and entered the realm of the truly significant. The cameras, usually fixed on the presiding chairman or a testifying witness, subtly adjusted their focus, zooming in on Crockett, sensing that this was no longer just another routine exchange, but a pivotal confrontation that demanded capture. Every flicker of emotion, every subtle gesture. Even the expert witnesses, seated at the long table before the committee members, seasoned professionals who had testified at dozens of these hearings, delivering their carefully prepared remarks, stopped pretending to review their notes. Their pens stilled, their gazes lifted, and they watched, unblinking, as if they were witnessing something they had never seen before, a fundamental shift in the very nature of the proceedings, a crack in the carefully constructed facade. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, known for her own battles with the established order and her willingness to challenge senior members of her party, sat 3 seats down from Crockett. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes fixed on her colleague, with an intensity that matched Crockett's own. She had been through her own share of intense confrontations with senior Democrats, moments where the unwritten rules of congressional politeness were cast aside for the sake of conviction. She recognized the precise moment when someone decides to stop playing by those unwritten rules, when conviction overrides convention, when the personal becomes irrevocably political. On the Republican side, Representative Jim Jordan, a master of creating drama and seizing every opportunity for partisan advantage in committee hearings, was unusually quiet. Even he seemed to understand, in that profound silence, that this was not about the usual partisan theatrics, the predictable political games. This was about something far deeper, far more fundamental, the existential question of how meaningful change actually happens in a system inherently designed to resist it, a system steeped in tradition and resistant to radical transformation, a raw clash of ideologies. The gallery behind them, usually a collection of bored interns, sleepy tourists, and a handful of dedicated activists, was packed with advocacy groups, tenacious journalists, and wide-eyed law students who had come expecting another tedious policy discussion, another exercise in legislative tedium. Instead, they were witnessing a masterclass in political courage, a raw, unfiltered display of conviction that transcended the often cynical world of Washington politics. Phone cameras, once a forbidden distraction in the decorum of congressional hearings, now discreetly emerged, not primarily for social media spectacle, but because people instinctively understood that they were seeing something that needed to be preserved, an unrepeatable moment that would be recounted for years to come, a historical footnote in the making. Crockett took a single, deliberate breath. In that fleeting pause, which stretched for an eternity, you could almost hear the collective intake of breath from everyone in the room, a shared moment of suspended animation. It was the kind of dramatic silence that precedes a pivotal turning point, the calm before the full force of a storm was unleashed. This was the moment that would define not just the hearing, but potentially the entire criminal justice reform movement, a stark illustration of the deep ideological rifts within even allied factions, a battle for the soul of justice. Representative Lieu talks about being realistic, she began, her voice gaining a quiet, formidable power that commanded absolute attention. Let me tell you what's realistic. Her gaze swept across the committee members, then back to Lieu, her eyes burning with an unshakable conviction, an almost fiery intensity that seemed to penetrate his carefully constructed composure. It's realistic that a young black man in my district gets 5 years for the same drug offense that gets a white kid from the suburbs probation. The words landed like individual hammer blows, each one a stark, undeniable truth, a raw wound exposed. The racial disparity, a painful and enduring reality in the American justice system, was laid bare, undeniable and raw, devoid of euphemism or academic detachment. It's realistic that families are torn apart because we've collectively decided that punishment matters more than people, she continued, her voice rising slightly, imbued with an undeniable moral authority that silenced any potential interruption. It's realistic that cycles of poverty and crime are perpetuated because we lock people up without investing in their rehabilitation, without offering a genuine second chance, without recognizing their potential for redemption. It's realistic that our prisons are overflowing, our communities are suffering under the weight of this broken system, and yet we call genuine reform idealistic because it dares to challenge the status quo, because it demands fundamental change instead of incremental tweaks. Lieu shifted in his seat, visibly uncomfortable, the carefully constructed facade of his composure beginning to crack. He had clearly not anticipated this level of direct, personal, and emotionally charged confrontation. In the meticulously structured world of congressional hearings, members usually directed their comments to witnesses or spoke in carefully crafted generalities about policy, maintaining a veneer of detached professionalism. They did not call each other out by name, with this kind of searing intensity, in such an unvarnished manner, especially not from within their own party. He attempted to interject, to regain some semblance of control over the narrative, to diffuse the escalating tension. I respect the Congresswoman's passion, Lieu began, his voice attempting to convey a measured, conciliatory tone, a common tactic to diffuse tension by acknowledging emotion without fully engaging with the substance. But Crockett, her eyes still fixed on him, unblinking, cut him off instantly, sharply, with a single, devastating word. Don't. Her voice was low, but carried an absolute, unyielding force that brooked no argument. Now, don't do that. She took a step closer to the podium, leaning forward slightly, her hands still resting on the chair back, but her posture now radiating an almost predatory focus, a laser-like intensity. Don't dismiss what I'm saying as passion, like it's some kind of irrational emotion that clouds judgment, that makes my arguments less valid. Her voice, though still calm, was now edged with steel, a razor-sharp precision. This isn't passion, Representative Lieu. She paused, letting the full weight of her next words settle into the profound silence of the room, a silence that felt heavier than any sound. Her gaze was unblinking, unwavering, and utterly compelling, drawing every eye to her. This, Jasmine Crockett declared, her voice resonating with the quiet, formidable authority of lived truth, echoing through the chamber, this is experience. The statement hung in the air, a definitive, unassailable truth. It was a mic drop, not of volume, but of undeniable reality, a powerful, irrefutable declaration. It was a declaration that her arguments were not born of abstract ideals, of theoretical constructs, but from the raw, gritty, often heartbreaking ground zero of the American justice system, from countless hours spent bearing witness to its flaws and its profound human cost. The fight had just begun, and the rules of engagement had been irrevocably rewritten. The Rayburn House Office Building, usually a temple of staid decorum and procedural rituals, had become a courtroom, its quiet halls now echoing with the undeniable force of truth, and the jury was the nation itself, watching and listening to every word.